All right, all right. Thank you guys for tuning in to Talking in Technicolor, the very best in public access psychedelic television. My name is Ryan, and I am here to just give you a little bit of a preview for this episode. Basically, what I have done is interviewed a gentleman, a good friend of mine, before and after his very first psilocybin and cannabis experience. Up until this point, this person has been very straight laced, has not done anything really more than alcohol and tobacco, maybe caffeine. So, in terms of psychoactive substance use in the past, it's almost none other than just the day to day stuff we have in our society. So, just a fair warning as we go in the before portion of the video. I was using a not so good camera and a not so good microphone that I've since replaced. So the audio is going to be just so so for that portion. If that is intolerable for you, if it's a deal breaker, the second half of the interview, the afterward, several weeks later, I'd gotten a better microphone. So that's going to be at about 53 minutes. So if you do skip ahead to that part, that's going to be where my friend Brian tells his trip story and talks about how psilocybin and cannabis that evening, that combination, has affected his life. And personally, I have to say it's a pretty cool transformation. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in to a new adventure in psilocybin. My friend here has never taken any sort of substance other than alcohol.
And caffeine, alcohol, and that's about it. Nothing else really fancy.
Yeah, so I guess could you talk to us about what in your life has made you decide to just stick with alcohol and caffeine up until this point?
I mean, honestly, I don't even do alcohol that much. I'm more of a social drinker than anything. If I'm alone or home by myself or whatever, I usually don't drink anything. It's usually only at parties. But for me, it's just, I don't know. Most drugs never really held much of appeal for me. Every time I've ever seen or heard about it, everybody's doing it just for the sheer fun of doing it, but there's no other real benefit or need to do it or anything like that. They're just doing it to either rebel or just go off and escape life. It's usually the perception I've had.
Okay.
I'm not saying that that's the true case. I'm just saying that that's the perception I've had.
Sure. And for those listening or watching or reading about this, depending on what medium we have going, I would be interested in finding out, obviously, whatever test you have for yourself as to whether or not a substance belongs in your life. The calculus has come up a little bit different in terms of mushrooms, since you're interested in trying psilocybin mushrooms soon. So could you tell me what makes the difference in that calculus for you?
What makes the difference for me is the fact that for psilocybin specifically, the reason I'm willing to try it is that there's been universities that have put out studies and done research and shown that for people with depression or anxiety and all of these debilitating mental illness issues, it's actually having an effect that's helping people. And it's not just escaping life or just having fun, it's trying to help make your life better. It's kind of like a medicine in that sense, instead of just if you want to go old school 1980s, like we were beat over the head PSA, and drugs are bad and you'll kill people, and it's none of that stuff. It looks like it's something that can actually help people.
Sure.
I've never been clinically diagnosed with anything, but oftentimes I'm usually in the dumps, and it's hard to get up and move around and actually care about doing things sometimes, and it just feels like I'm fighting depression most of my life, and I'd like to try to break the cycle.
That's great. Yeah, you were mentioning the studies they've been doing. The big one that comes to my mind is Johns Hopkins University actually has a study out that shows that psilocybin can be 70% effective in treating treatment-resistant depression.
Mm.
That's the reason I myself got into it at first. And I've heard a number of people tell me myself that psilocybin has saved their lives.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but I think it's also important to note that when you do this sort of thing, you need to go and do it with a good amount of intention and understanding what you're seeking, what your goals are going in, as well as special attention to set and setting. Do you know what set and setting are?
I couldn't say in this framework. No. I don't know what you mean by that. I'm guessing like the ambiance of what you're doing while you're taking mushrooms, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so that's the setting aspect. For instance, I like to have, you know, tapestries.
It's very colorful. I approve of this, actually.
Thank you. But yeah, so setting is going to be where you are. You know, is it safe? Are you comfortable? You know, what is the temperature like in there? Do you have plenty of snacks and beverages at your disposal? Do you have someone there with you to make sure you're going to be safe and all right? I always recommend a trip sitter. A lot of people would prefer to go into the woods and do it by themselves, and I'm more of a, you know, hideaway in an unoccupied room in my house, knowing that my wife is in the next room if I run into any sort of psychic dilemma. So yeah, the set is kind of what you bring to it. I would say what emotionally is going on with you that day, your mindset. So when you say set, you can think of it as being short for mindset.
Okay.
And setting, of course, as we mentioned, just where are you doing it. So we won't talk about where you're planning on doing it.
That's probably best for any number of reasons, but.
But yeah, so I guess I'd like to know a little bit more too about what your intention is. I know you said because you feel down, so this is going to be something they call a boundary dissolving drug.
Okay.
So it's going to tear down all the boundaries that you have put up, like firewalls you have against things that you don't want to think about. So for me, I would be really curious to see what your intention is going in, and maybe what some worries you have could be. Like, what do you fear, as to whatever extent you're comfortable sharing? What sort of material do you think that could come up that could be troubling for you, too?
I've debated on it back and forth as we've been talking about trying it and everything. And honestly, I don't know. From the way you've explained it to me, it sounds like people that go in thinking they're going to have an experience towards one thing that they think their worries are all about, they end up something else entirely different. To me, I've got a lot of things worried with family, my job, finances, I mean, just where am I going in life, all this kind of stuff. But for all I know, there's other stuff that is more deeply rooted that I'm not acknowledging.
Sure.
Which, I mean, I have a small study and hobby in neuroscience. I'm not an expert. Don't quote me as any expert on that, but I know enough about the brain and psychology and stuff to know that we protect ourselves. We hide ourselves from the stuff that really scares us or bothers us sometimes, and we just don't even admit it, and we boggle ourselves down in the other stuff that we think we can handle.
Sure.
So I might be worried about all this other stuff, but it's actually something else that's worrying me more.
Sure.
So I'm aiming to go in with thinking that this is the stuff I'm worried about, and I keep worrying about it and ruminating and going in a circle, and I'd like to just break getting in a circle and find a path forward to deal with some of this stuff.
Well, I think, in my experience, that psilocybin is a really great way to break those cycles. You know, if you think about your normal neural pathways, when you're used to doing things in a circle, used to, you know, maybe you had some trauma when you were a child, and
I'm aware of.
or maybe you had just some interaction that shaped how you are now, right? And I'm talking universal, you, not you in particular, right?
It's just people in general and how
Yeah.
they're formed,
So you might get used to reacting to something in a certain way. A great example, in my opinion, is my little 3-year-old. He, when he was a baby, burnt his mouth on soup. And now every soup, no matter what temperature it is, and I don't even know if he remembers this anymore, he will recoil like it's going to burn him, even if it's totally lukewarm. And
Even if you don't have the actual memory of it, there's still a muscle memory in the sense of the pain and experience.
right. And so my theory on this kind of stuff is that we create patterns in our lives that are largely based on traumas that we've had, and maybe that's something that protected us at one time, like to feel nervous when you're in a certain situation because maybe you're a kid and you need to do what you need to do to protect yourself, and then you grow into an adult and you still have that reaction once you're at a point where it no longer serves you. So when you take psilocybin or other psychedelics, by and large, what happens is this part of your brain called the default mode network gets depressed. So that's your typical pathway of all your neurons. So what'll happen then is you will find new neural pathways around. So that's why you end up seeing people, for instance, who might have a stutter. There's a famous guy, Paul Stamets, talks about having a stutter until he takes a large dose of psilocybin and totally breaks that habit. And
was it like a sudden thing for him, or?
Yeah, next day he woke up and realized he wasn't stuttering anymore, and that was his intention going in. Was once he started the trip, he realized, I want to work on my stutter. Don't stutter anymore, and he stopped. For instance, I also knew a gentleman who had a traumatic brain injury, and he was slurring and drooling and couldn't remember anything. So because he was super depressed, he took a high dose of mushrooms, trying to be self-destructive. But as he was sitting there with his buddies, they realized, hey, you're not slurring anymore. You're not drooling, and you're acting the way you used to. You don't seem depressed anymore either. And from that time, he's no longer had the same level of motor problems and speech problems and memory problems. He still has some problems, obviously, because he has a traumatic brain injury, but his theory is that this big trip rewired his neural pathways around the damage. So, I mean, and those are purely anecdotal, but you hear stuff like that all the time. Myself, I've held space for a few people, and what I mean is trip sit, you know, and you call it holding space because you're kind of holding on to just, I guess, just creating a safe space for that person.
Okay.
Right? And so you're available if they need anything, but most times it's just sitting and being with them. But I had one person who was really very torn up about stuff that happened in Afghanistan. She saw someone explode.
Oh, that would stick with you a while.
Yeah, so she went into her trip thinking, I'm going to think on this the whole time. There's no way for me to avoid it. I'm just going to embrace it and finally get through this problem once and for all. And when she went in, it was all rainbows and butterflies and balloons is what she told me she saw. And the message to her was that I've spent so much time thinking about this. Thinking about it anymore isn't going to fix it. I can let go now. I've rationalized it every way I can. I can let go. So yeah, like you said, you can expect one thing and something totally different will happen. And it's sort of the beauty of it is, however you're thinking now, you're going to look back and realize afterwards that you couldn't have thought the way you do in the future once you get there, because it'll be a totally new way of thinking.
That'd be interesting to see.
Yeah, and
I get tired of getting stuck in the same cycle.
yeah, tell me more about that.
Well, I mean, they've talked about this through like you were talking about with the default neural node, and basically they've also done this on chemical aspects involved with the brain. They've known this for probably a decade or two now, where you can actually become addicted to your emotions. I mean, most of your emotions have chemical releases and hormones involved, and your brain has receptors for those. The more you pump out a certain hormone or chemical in your body from an emotion, the more receptors your brain's going to have to receive that. So over time, you just have more and more of the bad hormones, I don't know the specific names,
Sure.
unfortunately, that come from, like, being depressed or sad or angry and upset all the time. And you just get stuck in that mode because that's what your brain is looking for.
Yeah, for sure.
It's not that you are wanting to get stuck in this mode, it's just that your brain is designed to do this.
Yeah, you're sort of predisposed at that point.
Exactly. So for me, I keep dreading and thinking and worrying about everything that could go wrong. I keep trying to come up with plans to prevent things from going wrong.
Oh, really?
I always have been very worried that no matter what I do, everything's going to fall apart.
Yeah.
No matter how hard I try. I mean, I always get stuck wondering over whether this is the right path or that's the right path.
Sure.
I have a habit of overanalyzing and just getting stuck in the worrying about it and never actually doing anything.
So what, if you could think in a way that you find more healthy, what do you think that would look like?
Honestly, I don't know. I mean, being more decisive would be one thing. Just not getting bogged down, taking the time to think that, yes, this is a bad situation, yes, this stuff has to be weighed into the equation, but overall you have to have a path. So here's the best path that you can find, stick to that, get it done, and stop second-guessing yourself all the time.
Okay, okay. So with that in mind, what do you have any fears related to the outcome of this experiment and how it could affect you in the long term, or even in the short term?
I mean, as far as fears about it, I mean, I usually don't do these things without doing some research and talking to people who know things about it. So the only reason I'm even considering doing it is because I've talked to you and some other people and looked up some of my own things, and I know that relatively it's safe. So I'm not really afraid of anything bad happening to me afterwards, or even really during, as far as I know. I mean, you always hear about people having a bad trip, but that's supposed to be on, like, really high doses and craziness and all that stuff. So, I mean, that'd be my only real fear.
Sure.
Which is sort of not really going to happen for this, so...
So the fear is having a bad trip.
Yeah.
That's a pretty standard fear, especially for those who haven't done this sort of thing. I would say I've had a number of bad trips, but the term that I like to use is challenging trip. Because a lot of times with the benefit of time between you and the trip, you can start to unpack some things and realize why you were where you were at that point. And, you know, the key is to act upon it. So even if it's something with a lot of negative feelings, you know, you might see ugly faces, or I've gone down my very first trip, a good portion of it was spent looking at bloody, gnashing teeth and skeletons and crabs, and that doesn't sound scary to anyone else, but I have an anaphylactic seafood allergy, so crabs are very, very frightening for me.
I don't know, a whole swarm of them is pretty terrifying, so...
Yeah, I mean, just in an insectoid kind of way, right? But before that trip, I had a fear of death that was so debilitating in my day-to-day life that I couldn't go 30 seconds without having a thought of death and gasping and being like, oh my god, I'm going to die. And it got to the point where I was so debilitated that I was considering ending my life. And so when I tried the mushrooms, it was because I saw Paul Stamets talking about them, and I know half of you are rolling your eyes right now. But yes, I saw Paul Stamets on the Joe Rogan Experience, and which people also love. And yeah, I ended up hearing him say that it extinguishes your fear reflex and fear of death, and I was like, sign me up. I had always thought it was a frivolous thing or something that people do at concerts and been like, no, you know, I don't want to become a burnout who does drugs. And here we are.
I would not say you're a burnout.
No.
And you're using drugs more to help you along. And it's
Yeah.
not really a drug, it's more medicine in my definition.
And for me, I'd probably use it once a quarter, maybe maybe 3 times a year.
Yeah, see,
So,
that's more medicinal by my definition. So I think you're fine. In my
yeah,
opinion.
I'm not someone sneaking off into the bushes and smoking DMT every 15 minutes, and I do know a few people like that, and it is troubling. Um, yeah.
I mean,
So,
growing up in the 80s and 90s, well, 90s for us, like, I mean, that's basically what we were beaten over the head with, too, whenever drugs was mentioned, so
yeah, just
it
say
gets
no.
stuck in your head.
Right. I remember being in high school, and my teacher, my science teacher, had us do a project on drugs, and everyone had to choose a drug. I chose mushrooms. I was like, mushrooms? I love mushrooms. That sounds cool. I didn't know they were a drug up until that point. Or that they could be drugs, right?
Yeah.
And, I hate the term drug, too. I usually say medicine, but also, the words has as much power as you give it.
True.
But she had blacked out with, like, a shitty school, like, what's the school marker brand? Like, Rose Art, maybe?
Oh, yeah, Rosette's a good
Or
one.
Marks-a-Lot. I think it was Marks-a-Lot.
Or Crayola,
Markers.
maybe.
I think it was a step down. I think it was Marks-a-Lot.
Okay, Marks-a-Lot.
But the black Marks-a-Lot would only sort of cover 2 things. So, all of the research that each student got, the teacher had to print out. So being very selective about what propaganda we get. But mine had almost nothing bad to say because it was about mushrooms. And it was all talking about the benefit of mushrooms and why people do them. And if you get caught with mushrooms, call us. We have a group of lawyers to defend you. And by all rights, mushrooms should be legal. And everyone else got like, don't do drugs. And mine's like, but maybe do mushrooms.
There's a potential benefit on these ones.
Yeah, and I was struggling in my report. The most I could come up with is you can have a bad trip. Other concerns are some people with underlying mental health conditions, like schizophrenia, personality disorder. It could be exacerbated.
Makes sense.
If you're bipolar and you don't know it, and you're like a healthy normal, like you're getting by, and you take psilocybin, you could have a manic episode. That is a risk. Because it does boost your serotonin level, and if you have trouble regulating that, that could be a problem. There's also some interference with different medicinal or pharmaceutical drugs that people are on. So, as far as I know, you don't take any psychotropics.
No, I mean, the only things I really take is prescription medicine when I have a doctor telling me to do it. Tylenol if I've got a small pain or a headache, and maybe like melatonin for sleeping, and the multivitamin. That's about all I ever really do.
Okay.
I don't do anything fancy or fun.
Sure.
I'm very boring, I'm sorry.
Good. No, and I think that's what makes you a really interesting candidate for this. Because for me, even, I would smoke marijuana. I have for probably the past 15 years. And it's something that, before I found that, I had very big troubles regulating my emotions, got very angry and agitated all the time, and it's really, I'm sure you've seen the time you've known me, it's really calmed me down.
Oh, yeah.
And then psychedelics, while the cannabis has been a good regulator for me, psychedelics are something that has dealt with a lot of the personality issues, the baggage that you're hanging on to for the since childhood. You can even bring back repressed memories, too.
That'd be interesting.
Yeah, so I had some memories of childhood abuse come back during a trip, so that's something to consider.
Well, like you were saying, you were calling it the boundary breaker, so
Yeah.
And that's a boundary when you suppress it.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I guess my other thought is, what do you think being on mushrooms is going to feel like?
I don't know. From what you've told me and a few other people have mentioned it, it's sort of different each time and for each person, from what I hear.
Very different.
So, I don't know. When I just throw it out there and just let my mind come up with whatever thinks, it's gonna be. It feels like it's gonna be like a warm, cozy hug or something relaxing and like enveloping and uplifting, maybe.
Yeah.
When I don't think about it, I just ask for, I don't know, an impression from my own brain or intuition. This is what I get.
Okay. Yeah. And for me, I would definitely say I have experienced it feeling like a big hug. and definitely enveloping. I'd say the biggest thing I hear people say, especially on higher doses, when they go well, is that there's a feeling of connectedness with the universe. You also, there's some common tropes. You might see someone in your life or something in your life that harms you that you're not aware of, and it may look like a monster or a skull. I've heard a lot of people who might be tripping with someone who they shouldn't have trusted turn into a goblin head. So if I'm around for this and all, we'll see how that goes.
Well, my impression of you in my head is nothing near goblin head, so I'm pretty sure that won't come up.
Well, you steered me wrong. I'm losing my mind. You can also see yourself aging or getting young again. A lot of time distortions, weird stuff like seeing aliens and space goddesses.
Oh, so that's what that's supposed to be.
I think so.
I mean, I couldn't figure it out. It was definitely something spacey, but I wasn't for sure.
I would say this is a pretty good example in my mind of when I close my eyes when I'm on mushrooms. It looks a lot like this. Lots of eyes, lots of colors. But that's just me. Not everyone experiences that. Some people have no visuals to speak of. Some people will just cry for 4 hours straight, bawl their eyes out. I had a friend have that occur. And
That
then
they feel really well afterwards.
I'm like, wow, was that really rough for you? And she's like, that was life-changing. That's one of the best things I've ever done. One thing that people tend to rate years afterwards from their first mushroom trip, they rate it up there in significance in their life with things like getting married, having children, things like that, graduating college, whatever, big life events, up there is doing mushrooms. And a lot of times it's people's only spiritual experience if you've never had that.
Yeah, sounds about right.
I myself am not particularly spiritual except when I do mushrooms. And
It's been called a gateway at times.
yeah. So, well, dog is scratching her collar.
Yeah, we should be fine though.
Daisy, go to your bed, baby. Alright, we'll think twice about having the dog in here next time.
It's alright. She's not doing anything right now, so.
Baby girl, come here. But, yeah, it could be any number of things. So you think you'll just mostly have a feel?
Yeah, I mean, that's just what I'm guessing at right now.
Do you have any thoughts on what you might experience visually? Or what you might hear?
Here, probably a lot of things, but I don't know. It'll probably either be finally straightforward, whatever's in the back of my head that's hidden behind all kinds of other jumbled mess of voices, or it'll just be the same jumbled voices that I'm always dealing with in my head for the different things I always second guess, and I end up somehow sorting through it during the trip.
Do you feel like your mind is made up of competing voices?
At times, yeah.
Yeah.
They're usually in the same general direction, just a slight different opinion as how, kind of a thing.
Yeah, I read an article that said something to the effect of, we think of ourselves as having one mind, but it's really several competing, almost mindlets or partitions, and whichever one's talking the loudest at one time is what you perceive. So that's one interesting thing about mushrooms is it kind of shuts that whole system down for 6 hours.
Okay.
To where parts of the mind that normally compete are actually communicating with one another, which is really interesting.
We might actually get some resolution up in here finally. That'd be nice.
You might.
To talk to each other would be great.
Well, and that's my theory on why, and this came to me when I was on mushrooms, so it could just be a goofball thought. But
oh, well, let's hear it out. Let's see what it says.
my feeling is that when you take mushrooms and you close your eyes and see things like sacred geometry, like pentagrams and, I don't know, D12s, crazy geometric shapes floating in space, that what's really happening is some other portion of your mind that doesn't normally communicate with the visual part of your brain is communicating with the rest of your mind.
Mhm.
Or alternatively, that you are seeing language transmitted through the visual part of your brain.
Mhm.
And to me, if I were to imagine what an architect, or I'm sorry, what an artifact
Mhm.
of that sort of mental process looks like,
Mhm.
is it would be some of the visuals you get when you close your eyes. I think it's maybe just an artifact um, of those streams of communication overlapping with each other.
No, that makes a little sense in a way. I mean, there's a number of conditions in the brain and everything that can happen. They're rare, but they do happen, where people will taste things that they hear and stuff like that, and you can get the same effect on LSD.
Yeah,
And
you can get on
other drugs
mushrooms
like
as well.
that. And I mean, it's basically just your brain wiring data to run through a circuit. It wasn't designed to handle that type of data input. If you
Yeah.
want to get computer ease on it.
Sure. Well, and so that effect, apparently Kanye West claims to have it,
Huh?
it's called synesthesia.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's one of the ones I was thinking of.
Yeah, so some people who like compose music historically could see, and some people do see music just because of how their brain works. When I've done this, I've been able to feel an image, like there was a beam of light on, and I felt like I could touch it. So that's as far as it's gone for me, but there is definitely that crossover that happens. Let's see, what else can I ask you? Let's see. Okay, so once you go through with this, um, what is your intention to do with the information you receive afterwards? Like, how are you going to process it?
Well, honestly, for me, I end up processing different sets of information differently. So, in one respect, it depends on what I get.
Yeah.
My main goal is to try to understand what it is that's happening in my brain and what it's trying to tell me that I'm not answering to.
Sure.
So, I mean, my best way to put it is that I'm just going to look at it bit by bit, try to separate some of the disparate parts of it, analyze those little parts, and then bring it back to the whole big picture again, and see how the big picture fills in,
Sure.
even with the little bits in it. Because honestly, I mean, just in life, I've seen a number of times where you can focus on all the little details you want, and you can get those perfect, but then the big picture is shit,
Sure.
and it just falls apart, and everything's bad, and people hate you, and whatever else you want to think of.
Right.
But you can look at the big picture, have all the details fall apart, but everything's still fine. So I would like to think that I could process it in a way to looking at it from the big picture and letting go of some of the worries of the little shit.
Okay. Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of letting go of little shit in what you're hoping to achieve.
Well, like I said, I get stuck up on it.
Sure. So, what do you think is the most, in your mind, like the most likely outcome of this? Like, both in terms of when you take it and what Brian 2.0 look like down the road?
Well, the likely outcome that I'm looking for or expecting would be definitely something different has happened. And everybody gets worried about if it's a good different or bad different. Different is different.
Yeah.
You never know what's good or bad for you until you get through shit. I mean, a lot of people have bad experiences, but they're actually better for it.
Sure.
And people who turn bad from good experiences. Back and forth. So, I just want to get something different from what I'm doing. I
Sure.
just don't want to feel like I'm stuck in the same routine.
That's perfect. I think this will be perfect for that. Yeah, and I think that I liked what you said there about sometimes a bad thing can happen to you, and it can be a good experience. And I think that's sort of some of the emotional maturity that people need to bring to psychedelics in general. You know, I was giving a talk sometime in the past year, and you know, we talked about challenging trips versus you know, good trips or easy trips, and he said, I don't like the word challenging trips because I had a bad trip. And for a year after that, I could barely get out of my house. It made me agoraphobic, and that wasn't something I had before. And of course, you really need to be respectful of people's experience, so I just said, okay, thank you for your experience. I appreciate your input. But truly, my thought on stuff like that is, sure, it brought up some bad material that was hard to deal with, or maybe challenging material, right? Something that felt bad to you. And, you know, you gotta look at this in terms of, not is it fun, but what message am I getting from it? What can I change in my life so it's not as challenging next time? Or what is this showing me in myself that I need to address going forward?
Yeah, like I was saying at the beginning, the calculus for me changed because now that there's evidence that it can be medicinal and actually improve lives, rather than just, hey, let's go have fun and trip out on mushrooms and see weird things. It's, no, let's have a mushroom trip, try to get myself on a better path, or face something that I'm not facing.
Good. I think that's very healthy. And I think it's good that you're going in knowing that it could be challenging, but also being willing to do the work to get through it. I do think that with psychedelics, it's really important to have that perspective, because it will be work. It's not fun, necessarily, if you're doing it for therapeutic use, like for yourself. You can take it with friends and laugh and giggle and do like a low dose and look at the stars and have a wonderful time, feel connected with nature, be naked outside.
Hey, more power to them if you want to have fun.
All of these things I have done, and they're wonderful.
It's just not my thing, but you go for it.
Right.
That sounds great, honestly. I'm just too shy.
Right. I was, and then I took mushrooms, so who knows?
Oh, maybe after this I'll join you. Who knows?
We'll go down to the hot springs, which is a genuine offer. We could do that sometime.
I am down.
Put you on the spot.
Okay, I am down. And you got evidence that I said I'm down.
Yeah, that's right.
I can't back out of this one.
Yeah, so I think, though, what you have happen, right, is I've had many people say it's like 6 years of therapy in one night. And having been in talk therapy, it is a slog. It takes a long time to work through issues and have breakthroughs, and it might take years. One dose of mushrooms fixed in me stuff that I've been carrying around for 28 years at the time. And now at 30, I feel like such a more well-adjusted person. Even if I'm not like this super ego magnificent version of myself, I still have problems, but I do find myself, rather than thinking with many minds like you're describing, after I take mushrooms for several months, I think with one mind. There is one stream of consciousness that's much calmer and better integrated.
Focus on taking care of things one at a time.
Right. Exactly. So, you know, another thing I wanted to talk to you about was integration. So, you know, we do once a month with the Psychedelic Club at CSU in Fort Collins. I host an integration circle, so we get together in small groups and talk about our psychedelic experiences. So the point with that is you have a group of people, and you know, you can't go talking to your coworkers about your psychedelic experience. Maybe,
especially where I work.
Yeah, you know, maybe your mom or your aunts definitely wouldn't understand. And my mom, bless her heart, has been very supportive and has listened to me prattle on about psychedelic stories. And I think she's seen the therapeutic value it had. But it's still important to have people who've done it you can talk to. And also to look at different ways that you can work through your experiences. You know, so integration can mean taking the messages you've received and integrating them into your life. It could also mean integrating yourself back into your own body afterwards and becoming more grounded and mindful as you reintegrate into yourself. Because a big part of psychedelics, I do feel, it shatters your personality and then builds it back together in sort of a new configuration. Which that thought scared me before, but not now.
Now that you've been through it a couple times.
Yeah, once it's over, you won't feel a thing.
Okay. The subtext there, I think, is needed.
Right? Yeah. So, I guess, you know, some people like to draw, some people like to meditate, do yoga, stretch. What do you think your integration process is going to look like? What do you think you might do?
So I think I understand what you mean by integration is like how I'm going to go about processing it and taking in and internalizing all the messages.
As well as returning to regular life and back into your body, you know.
Now, I mean, I do a little bit of meditating here and there, but most of that comes down to like martial arts stuff. Like it's when you're focused on one type of thing,
Mm-hmm.
you're focused on doing that one thing. That's actually a form of meditation. It's what Shaolin monks do.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done that martial arts stuff, non-martial arts stuff. It's just if I get absorbed in one thing, then I get focused, and it helps me just sort of calm everything down. And I somehow come out of it having an idea of something that I was never even working on before while I was focused on this thing.
Good, good.
So I might be doing some of that. I'll definitely think about it. I have drive times between places where I work and stuff like that, and I usually think and debate philosophies in my head sometimes and stuff like that. And I'll probably think about it and be like, what did this mean, or what should I do with this, that
Sure.
kind of thing. A lot of it is probably just going to be making sure that I remember that it doesn't matter what I've experienced, even if I've come out of it going like, everything's good, I've reached enlightenment, I am the heavenly Buddha, or whatever else happens to me. I still have to go back to my life. I still have things to do. Still have people I want to spend time with, things that I want to accomplish. I mean, I'll have a great experience probably, but I still have to do the rest of life.
Yeah, so I'm sure I've talked to you about this before, but one phrase I love is a Zen Buddhist phrase. It's before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. So I always try to bring that into my life as well. A lot of people go off on this. Not a lot, a minority of psychedelic users, but a very vocal minority. Just continue to do psychedelics all the time and kind of take that to be sort of the almighty in their life. And I think it's very tempting to get there because you'll see and do amazing things in this mindscape, then come back to real life. And some people kind of get more in touch with that and maybe less in touch with, I guess, agreed upon reality, consensus reality.
Yeah.
And, you know, so there are some casualties of the psychedelic experience out there in that it's important to remember that it's sort of the finger pointing at where you want to go, but some people think that that's the end location, the destination. And, you know, for me, there was a time where I hung it up. I said, I got the message, I'm hanging up the phone. Went 6 months without doing it until I decided, you know, it was the right time again recently. And, you know, people sometimes, you'll say, oh, you know, what's your favorite drug? And they'll say, oh, well, DMT, you know, it's amazing. Great. Well, how often do you do it? Oh, last time was 30 years ago. I'm still unpacking everything that happened. Yeah, great drug. Did it one time. And, so that's the thing.
If you get a lot out of it one time, that makes sense.
I'd say a lot of people end up just doing it one time, 2 times. You know, a lot of people also, like me, will do it a few times a year. And some people like to microdose with small amounts, which I know you've mentioned you did recently.
Yeah, I did try that a little bit. And it helped. It didn't give me like any like massive change in my mood, but it did make me feel a little less worn down, I guess I should say.
So it gave you some energy?
I was just less tired. I wouldn't necessarily say energetic, but I wasn't as exhausted.
Did you feel any motivation from it?
No more than I normally have, just I didn't have that dragging me down, so the motivation I had actually was more effective.
Okay. That's really interesting.
That would be the way I describe it anyway.
Sure. Yeah, for me, I do always feel like I'm less worn down as well, like I can just get more done. I've been microdosing a little bit lately. Every time I go to float, which we'll do soon, I take a microdose and wow, just that little bit and floating there suspended with your thoughts. It kind of combines the best world, I think, of meditation and psychedelics. You could actually get visuals and they're completely sober, but for me it takes just a microdose of mushrooms and off I go. I always go in with an anxiety level about a 9 and come out with about a 2 or a 3.
That's a pretty good change.
That's significant enough for me to want to do it every week. I actually am skipping, canceling my talk therapy to just, because it costs me $100 a therapy session,
Mm-hmm.
but
It's expensive.
it's $45 to float,
Mm-hmm.
and I get significantly more benefit from one than the other.
Oh yeah, I mean, as long as it doesn't end up hurting anything, I don't see a reason why not. It's just
No.
make sure you get some goodness out of it.
Yeah, and there's
And
different
things are worth
practices.
it.
Well, there's different practices for different people. For you, it could be therapy, meditation, yoga, karate, any sort of martial arts, art, dance. And I do think it's really important to have supplemental things, not have your whole mental health practice just be psychedelics.
Yeah, like I'm really trying to get into stone sculpting as my main second hobby, but it's just making myself get up and do it. It's been hard, and I'm hoping if I break my cycle of always being depressed,
man.
I'll actually do it.
That would be a great thing to think about while you're on the mushrooms, to meditate on a little bit. Because I found my level of my artistic nature has been amplified fivefold since I started doing psychedelics. For the first time in years, I'm drawing
Clearly,
again.
I mean, you've got some creativity in there somewhere.
Yeah, I'm trying to learn to draw kind of like this too, so I'm keeping this up for inspiration. So, as corny as that might sound, it's been really nice to have that. But yeah, so you might find yourself feeling more artistic afterwards. I've begun feeling much more musical lately, and so parts of your brain that you don't normally stimulate might get stimulated. And so I hope you do start box sculpting again. That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah. I've been having fun with it when I actually sit down and do it. I just do it so rarely.
Well, maybe you'll get inspired from this and come up with something that you just have to carve. That's some of these projects, like, oh, I want to start recording content. That came to me on mushrooms, so here we are recording some content.
And good content it is.
Maybe. I hope anyone watches it if we do put it. If you allow me to put it up.
That's fine with me.
Great.
You have documented proof. I have sent it.
There we go. So, let me see. We talked about what you plan to do to integrate. Would you be interested in coming to Integration Circle, talking to some other people about it?
It'd be worth a shot just to see if I relate my experience, if somebody else can help me filter through it, maybe.
I think you'll find a lot of common ground with people. I myself, in this group, for instance, is really niche, and one thing since I started doing this practice for myself is I've determined to be even more open, and that's something I really pride myself in, just being very open about everything. And so for me, I'll be like, okay, so I realized I got molested when I was a child, when I was on psychedelics. That wasn't very fun. And 4 people would be like, yeah, I was molested too, and I think that was where I got my PTSD, or I was sexually assaulted, or it can be stuff like, oh, I got into really bad debt, and someone will yeah, me too. Or a common one is drug addicts.
Oh, yeah.
Will take psychedelics and then no longer be addicted to drugs. I know for the uninitiated that sounds goofy.
That we need right now. It makes sense considering what the research has shown psilocybin doing to the brain and how addiction works on the brain.
Yeah, there's a lot of former alcoholics that we talk to as well.
I mean, like what I mentioned earlier with being addicted to your depressed hormones that are making you feel depressed all the time. I mean, it's basically the same idea. Probably, as far as I know, 10 times worse, but it's basically the same concept. So if mushrooms helps depression, it makes sense it would help with addictions.
Yeah, and that's not to say that it's a magic bullet for everybody. But certainly, I've seen binge eating disorder, cigarette smoking, alcohol. But then again, there's things like hypnosis that can be effective on that. So it's all about what works for you. Maybe it's psychedelics, maybe it's therapy, maybe it's some pharmaceutical. And I feel like it's really important not to judge on that as well. There's a lot of people in the psychedelic community who look down on people who take an SSRI.
I mean, if it helps them, keep doing it. Do what helps you.
I feel like going outside is a great antidepressant. But so is citalopram. And so is, at least it has been for me, and so is psilocybin, and a combination of a low dose of citalopram, a very low dose of citalopram, and occasional mushroom trips has saved my life.
Mm.
When I do both of those things together consistently, I know I'm well.
Mm.
When I drop one or the other, that's when things get a little tricky. And that's worked for me for the past few years. So that's what works for me. It might not be what works for you. That's okay.
Yeah, you just have to find out.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Good. So I'm glad you're open to talking with people about it, though. And I think it's really important once you experience something so strange that you have a little bit of support, both in friends and family, and just sometimes just someone to talk to. And it's hard to talk to, say, your coworker about that time that you grew 1,000 eyeballs on your chest, and
This is light lunch banter for women.
right, an alien came from space and ripped your guts open, and vomited into your chest cavity, and you feel great afterwards.
And make sure you ask about the report after you describe this.
Right, exactly. And then, that's when for lunch you get to piss in a cup, right? So, if you're really lucky, you end up in a cage. So, okay, well, I think we've covered some really good ground. Is there anything else related to this you want to talk about? Any final thoughts?
I mean, the only real final thought I had is I just hope everything works out for me in the long run.
Okay.
I'm open to trying to get something changed finally.
Awesome. And this is going to be like a little bit of a time capsule for you. I'm going to have you watch it afterwards. So I'd like to see if you also have a message for future Brian. If there's anything you'd like to say to yourself in a few weeks.
Just keep trying. Even if this doesn't work, something will. Just keep trying. Because you can't give up on it.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and feelings with me, and I'm really excited to see how this works for you. So, when we come back from our commercial break, no, but when we come back here in a little bit, we'll ask some of these same questions and just have you describe your experience. I'm really looking forward to that. All right. Thank you, buddy.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us here again on Talking in Technicolor. My name is Ryan, and I am here tonight with my friend Brian, and he has been like my best friend in the world for many, many years, and I have seen him in the past have some wintertime blues, to be certain, and struggling with some life stuff. Would you say that's fair?
Oh yeah, definitely fair.
Yeah, and don't we all? So I never stigmatize anyone for having a tough time, but because I've been there as well. But me and Brian have been talking for a while, and he had spoken with me previously about how I'd overcome some of my death anxiety and dealt with some of the existential questions that would keep me up at night through the use of psilocybin, meditation, counseling, a few different lifestyle changes and choices I made over the past few years. And one tool in the broad tool belt of possible mental health practices that can be beneficial in your life is psilocybin mushrooms. So after some time and talking about it, Brian had the insight to say this might be something that could help him. So we kind of jumped at the opportunity to record him beforehand, and hopefully you've seen that part by now, where I interviewed him before he ever did his first psilocybin experience. So this is kind of the opportunity to do an after interview with him. So basically what that is going to be for us is we're doing sort of a integration session where we're going to try to unpack some of the things that he experienced, and you'll kind of see what I found to be a very fascinating psilocybin experience that he had happen, and I'm very, very excited to share his story with you. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Brian, and yeah, thanks, Brian, for coming over here today.
Oh yeah, thanks for having me, Ryan. It's interesting to sort of unpack a few things. It's been about a month,
Yeah.
since I did my experience, and I have to go back and recollect a few things. The big overarching scenes I remember, but there was a few little things I had to think of.
So let's take it back to the beginning. I outlined briefly kind of some of our conversation that we had, and I in a previous episode mentioned kind of a preview of what you'd been through, hinted at it, but I'd like to hear, like, where were you at in your life before you made this decision, and what kind of spurred you to do so?
No, it was basically a situation where there was a whole bunch of stuff going on, family wise and work related wise, and just emotionally, that it just felt like there was no way up. You're constantly below water, no matter how hard you push or swim. It was just a feeling of basically, it was like, what is the whole purpose of everything I'm going through? Because nothing ever gets better.
Sure.
No matter how hard I push or work or try, but I knew that I can't give up either. So I just had to keep going and draining myself more every day. It was basically the state I was in.
Sure. So, you were kind of going through some maybe cyclical thinking, getting in maybe a rut of like negative self-thought and things like that, would you say?
Oh, definitely.
Yes.
Constantly wondering if I was doing the right things, or if I was doing things hard enough, or if I should just give up and try something else entirely. Stuff like that.
Sure. So, like, as a recap for anyone who hasn't seen the previous portion, the before portion of this, I guess I would just be curious. I know we had talked about beforehand what some of your goals were in going into this trip. Can you recall what they might have been?
Honestly, my only real goal was to see if it would do like what I believe it was Johns Hopkins who did the original psilocybin study, and was releasing all this information that started a big revolution, I guess we could call it now. When I was hearing about the study and what they were finding, I was like, I might as well see if it's something that I can try, and maybe it'll help me in this way. My main goal was to see if it's something that would affect me the way that they were finding in their study, kind of a thing. Sort of just something to break the cycle and get me into a better headspace so I can actually take care of the problems in my life rather than just getting crushed by them.
Sure. So, kind of with your mood before you tried psilocybin, at that point where you're getting that area in your life where things seem really difficult, maybe almost untenable at times. It sounds like you're having a really hard time. Overall, like, how would you score, like, your mood? Like, 1 being, like, super sad, like, having a hard time, difficult getting out of bed in the morning, to, like, 10, completely elated, like, as happy as you can imagine.
Beforehand, I was definitely sitting at about a 1 or 2.
Wow.
At least the way I felt, anyway.
And so, tell me then about kind of how you felt since, like, comparison number there.
Good comparison number. I mean, I still have ups and downs, but honestly, it's felt more like a 7 or an 8 now.
That's fantastic.
Like, I can actually take care of life and things. Yeah, it sucks when it happens, and it's still frustrating because it doesn't stop anything that was causing me to feel that way, but at least now emotionally I can go and deal with them now.
Sure. So it sounds like maybe, you're acknowledging that mental health, at least from my perspective, kind of works like, when you compare weather and climate, you might have a really bad day, and that's indicative of a change in how you feel on that particular day, things going on in your life. But, climate being more the overall trend, right? So would you say that your emotional climate has improved?
Oh, drastically. Nowadays, if I get really down or depressed or sad about something, I can usually break myself out of it without having to go through weeks of effort of trying to put my head back right. Or I don't have to worry about if I get upset over something that it's still bothering me 3 days later, kind of a thing.
Sure.
I can actually get upset about it, be like, okay, this upset me, this is why, move on, and then just make sure things are better the next day. And I actually don't get as upset over things as I used to.
Sure. That's fantastic. I am just
Yeah.
so glad to hear that as a friend. And I think talking to Brian, just for you guys listening or watching, personally, I found as we've spoken with each other that he seems just more cheerful in general
Mm-hmm.
and satisfied and relaxed and less worried.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like, true to my own personal experience, that's very similar to what I've had prior. And I'm sure you've noticed that in my life as well.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so I guess obviously the before and after is like one thing that's really, really interesting to me. Just exploring a lot of wild stuff can happen in the middle, but what is the
Mm-hmm.
end result? You take this mushroom and see, is it going to reorganize my mind in a way that is beneficial to my life? So
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious for you. Do you feel like it's done that?
It's definitely giving me a better take on life now afterwards having it. So I do feel like it's definitely something that can
Oh,
help and does help.
pardon me for a minute. So we are back. We just took a quick break. I know that was pretty early, but usually I do these right when my kids go to bed, and they both wanted some hugs from their dad. So I paused, and I really appreciate Brian waiting patiently there. So thanks,
Hey,
Brian.
I don't have kids, but I know enough people with kids. I know how it goes.
Yeah, they just as they're developing in these really young stages, they need your love and support and just to know that you're there to feel safe. So, they just want a quick check-in sometimes. So,
Yeah.
more than happy to do that. Although you might catch little, if you turn your volume up really well, you might hear that him making little noises in the background. But you can only do so much. At any rate, what I'd like to talk to you about now, Brian, after we've taken that break, is your actual trip experience. So we saw from you that before and after there's been a significant and lasting for at least a month or two change in your mood so far.
Mm.
Um, so tell me about the in between. Like, what was your experience overall? Like, give us a story.
Well, the very beginning, it was actually sort of what I was been told it was going to sort of be like. I was
Mm-hmm.
told that in the initial stages, you would see little things like your vision might become a little sharper, or you might have certain senses become a little more sharper for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Or for me, it started to get to a little bit where it seemed like I was staring straight ahead, and things would sort of move back and forward, kind of like there's just sort of distortions a little bit, just sort of waves and that kind of a thing. And that's pretty much as far as it went for the longest time. And
Sure.
I went and not long after that, I started basically laying down in the dark and just letting to see where it goes, because I've been told several times in the past that when it hits, you basically just start riding the wave. You don't get a control or direct it. It goes where it's going to need you to go.
Yeah, and it's not always what you want to hear, but what you need to hear. Not
Mm-hmm.
not what you're hoping you think about. And oftentimes, if there's something that you're blocking yourself from thinking about, this is the time you're going to deal with it.
And for me, after I got laid down and everything, I just sort of sat and waited for a while, and my mind started drifting in a lot of different directions on several different subjects, honestly. But after a while, it just sort of started fixating on my girlfriend, honestly. For apparently, I hadn't been thinking of my girlfriend enough, I guess, because basically the whole next good portion of it was just reminiscing on memories and scenes of stuff that I've been doing with my girlfriend and happy times, and wishing we were doing more things together, kind of a thing, rather than me always running around or worried about this or that, and never being sort of present with her. Even if I'm in the same room for hours on end, I'm always off somewhere else in my head,
Sure.
worried about something else.
Present, but
So
not
it's
present.
exactly. And the whole time, I basically ended up crying like a little baby
I
for quite a long while. I was just crying about all the stuff that I was missing and fixating on instead of being there with her, kind of a thing.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one thing that we do as people sometimes is we get caught in this rut where we almost live on autopilot, you know?
Mm-hmm. That's
Like,
definitely the state I was in.
yeah, so do you feel like you've been more present since?
For the most part, yes. I still have my days where I'm out, but honestly, I think that's just sort of what happens to people in general when a lot happens during the week. And these
Yeah,
times, there's a lot happening. So,
for sure. It's interesting to think of all the different states your mind goes through, even unaltered by anything, you know, through the course of the day, just on your own chemistry, you know. I think it was Dennis McKenna, a fellow that I've read a lot of and heard a lot of interviews of, um, has said something to the effect of, you know, that reality or your perception is just a waking hallucination, you know? Like, really, what you're seeing is just chemical intermediaries representing what your eyes are being exposed to, but you could never actually see things authentically, like directly, you know?
well, that definitely gets into a big philosophical debate question. But, I mean, even chemistry and science based wise, there's a whole range of colors that, which is the name of that shrimp? There's a shrimp. I think it's the pistol shrimp.
Oh,
Is what
that
it's
one that
called.
makes a little sonic boom underwater, makes
Yep.
a flash of light
Its
show up.
its eyes are actually so much more developed than eyes. It can see hundreds of thousands of colors more than we can. Our eyes and our brain just are not developed to the point to see more than the colors that we see. So yeah, I mean, he's kind of right. Our minds concoct an interpretation based off the information that it can receive, and says, "Here's what you're seeing and noticing."
Yeah, and I think one more thing to kind of add into that, a lot of folks talk about this idea of sort of like a valve, that basically, you know, here's your normal perception, but then when you alter your consciousness so that you can experience things differently, maybe you sort of open that valve a little bit. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the idea is that, you know, our brains almost act as a filter, because there's so much information coming in, like a ton of information we couldn't possibly comprehend at the same time, that when you take a psychedelic, it sort of opens some of that reducing valve a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Now, there's been a number of brain scans done on people on different drugs, and they've seen the neurons firing and interacting that typically don't interact. So I can believe it.
well, and I think the interesting thing about neurons as well is, you know, when you get caught in a rut or caught in a pattern, you know, you can look at, you know, how people's neurons are firing, from my
Mm-hmm.
understanding, and see that, yeah, they are using well-worn patterns, but the psilocybin molecule apparently depresses your default mode network, so you know, typical system of patterns,
Mm-hmm.
and allows parts of the brain to associate more freely. So I think, you know, when you see some of those visions, maybe it's the visual part of your brain speaking loudest into your perception or something. I don't know.
No, I can see that.
Yeah, so I guess talk to us more about what you saw. Like, you said at first you were seeing things kind of wiggle around the room, like items in the
Mm.
room. And then I know from what you've told me, things got a little bit more intense later on, like had some full on visuals.
Oh yeah. I did end up after a little while of laying down and everything and crying for a bit. I ended up having to throw up. I was warned that would happen. So anybody else out there who's listening to this, it can happen. It happened to me, and I know I'm not the only one.
No, it's like, especially people who just crunch up the raw, you know, the dried mushrooms. A lot of people will puke because, you know, it's made of chitin, so it's not so easy for your stomach to digest. So a tea is a lot easier on your stomach, but maybe a little bit more intense.
Mm-hmm. And for me, after I did throw up, I felt so much better emotionally. It was kind of almost like I don't know, my subconscious mind going through the experience was telling it, you're getting rid of all of this emotional baggage that you've had on yourself for a while, and you're just throwing it out, kind of a thing.
Well,
I felt a lot lighter afterwards.
I think that's really beautiful, dude. And what it resonates with me because a lot of time that I've spent studying this stuff has been around South American traditions within theogens. And, you know, both of the major ones down there, ayahuasca and San Pedro, both of them you definitely purge from. At least I did. I know when I did ayahuasca and when I've done San Pedro, both of them I've just puked and puked and puked. And every time you puke, it feels, and in their culture, the symbolism is that as you're puking or, you know, you're purging, you're also purging your negative emotions, you're purging bad spirits, you're just purging up all of that black tar, that negativity that has like gathered on your soul. So to see you with a totally unrelated entheogen taking it and puking and feeling some of that cleansing purge from that is really interesting.
Sorry. There we go. My other phone was ringing. Sorry.
All good. So, you say you purged and then you felt a lot better.
Oh, yeah. After that, I went back to laying down, and that's when things started getting a little more interesting. After my sense of time was way off, so I thought it was like a half hour, but it might have been an hour or two later.
Well,
I was just laying around.
And if I recall, you redosed with a additional cup of tea. Is that right?
Yep, just a little extra to get over a hump there.
And so, would you say like about that's the point where things started getting more intense for you after you took that, or?
Oh, definitely. That's when I actually got into having actual visuals of something. And
Okay.
for a while, they were just sort of all kinds of different things. Nothing really coherent or anything that I really remember much of. Sort of like flashes of different colors or shapes would just show up every once in a while. But after it finally settled in on something, I got put into what felt like an empty room.
Really?
I don't know. There may be some fellow nerds out there who know this, but if anybody's seen Dragon Ball Z towards the middle of the series,
Oh yeah.
they're in a room called the Hyperbolic Time Chamber, where there's just this
Hyperbolic
empty
Time
white
Chamber.
void.
Yeah.
Yep. It's kind of like that is kind of where I was, except there was no building or anything. It was just a white void and me for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just sort of spinning around, and I'm only seeing nothing but white. And then I keep spinning, and I come across this tree. I'm not very good with tree species. I want to say it was a nice big oak or something like that. Something that definitely looked old and ancient. It was tall. It was definitely full of life, though. Like it's something that had withered through all kinds of things through thousands of years.
So how big was this tree?
Oh, easily you could probably say it's as big as like the redwood trees over in Northern California. It was a giant, old, ancient tree. And as I'm just staring at that, I'm feeling relaxed, but I keep feeling like there's this sense of something else other than me and the tree there.
You didn't feel alone.
No, I didn't. And it felt like a warming or welcoming presence kind of a thing that I was just waiting for it to come to me, and I was just had to give it a second because I was on its time, not my time kind of a thing.
I'll tell you, dude. Excuse me. Every time I've done mushrooms, I always feel like there's an alien presence in the room. And I don't mean that like extraterrestrial, but I never feel alone. It feels very much like there's the presence of someone else. Don't you think?
At least off this one experience I've had, I'd say, yeah.
And
This one was a big one.
So you're at this big tree. One thing I like to kind of dig into some of the symbolism that you send towards me in this, because I notice in most people's trips, there's, I'm fairly familiar as someone with a background in anthropology with world religions, beliefs, cultures. So I see a lot of symbolism that you see in ancient religions all over the world. So when you talk about a giant tree or a mighty oak, what that reminds me of is Norse mythology, the Yggdrasil, or the Axis Mundi of the world. And it's basically the shamanic idea that there's a a great pull that goes through the power center of the world. And it's usually like a mighty tree or a mighty oak or something to that degree. There's a lot of symbolism in that with like the North Pole and Santa Claus, and it's Nordic beliefs. And I'll tell you myself, in one of my trips, I transformed into a snake and climbed up a mighty Amazonian tree myself.
Hmm.
So this tree symbolism is really, really common, and it's really common in shamanic faiths throughout the world.
This is probably where the tree of life thing has been spread around so that everybody has some version of it, kind of a thing from what I've encountered myself.
Oh yeah, so you experienced it firsthand, which is kind of
Hmm.
cool. So you're at this oak, you feel like you're not alone, and then what happens?
Uh, After that, I see a hand, like I don't want to use the word dainty because it's used a lot, but it's definitely more of a feminine kind of looking hand that comes out, and it's got a white dress kind of drapery that's very kind of like silk or sheer kind of look to it.
Mm-hmm.
And a lady steps out, and it's a tall elf, like queen or priestess, whatever you want to call it, but it's an actual elven woman dressed in nice white clothing and everything, and her hair and limber spots on her dress are, and her arms have these like starlight silver crystal jewels just all throughout the whole thing. And she just sort of comes out and stares at me. I thought it was very strange that it was an elf lady of all things that I was talking to.
Well, and what's really interesting about that to me is, a lot of us who take psychedelics encounter entities on higher dose trips. So, with your initial dose and then a redose, sounds like in pretty quick succession, you probably had a much deeper experience, which I think, a lot of people out there say, oh, start by microdosing. I kind of disagree sometimes. I mean, maybe for some people that's the right move. For me, I'd say start with a visionary experience and then microdose after that, maybe to maintain, some of those feelings that have changed in your neurochemistry.
Maybe. We'll
But
have to see because I'm still new myself to this experience, but I don't know where I fall on that argument of the line. Microdosing and then maybe this or maybe never this experience. I don't know. I do know that having this experience, it sets a pretty good standard for my mind, and it keeps a certain message in my head, which I'm getting to with the rest of my story here. But
yeah, so you saw her, she looked like she had jewels. Was there a pattern to the jewels she had on her body?
mm, only a few parts, like on her necklace and her headdress. It was sort of like there was sort of a spacing, like it'd be a nice long oblong jewel, then a little circle one, and then another oblong. It just repeated that pattern kind of a thing.
Did it look like a net at all? Just out of curiosity? Or a web?
Basically, a net with a bunch of more like a web. Yeah, not necessarily a net. It didn't have interspacings.
And the jewels were the nodes? Would that be accurate?
The nodes and the strings in the case of mine.
Interesting. So that's one thing that me and Drew, who was on a previous episode, and me and Mike, who was on yet another episode, it seems most people's intense psychedelic experience, or a lot of them on mushrooms, see... Oh, did we lose you?
Yeah, sorry, my phone is yelling about battery.
Oh, do you need to plug it in?
I might need to here in a second. It's at 20%, so we got a little bit.
We are back again. Sorry about that, guys. Low battery there on Brian's phone. And we also had to
Wouldn't you know it?
We had to take a brief ASMR break. So anyway, we will get back to it here. So we were talking about some of the net-like pattern you maybe saw across this entity's body.
Yep.
And one thing that I found really interesting about that is there's this concept in, I believe it's Hindu symbolism called Indra's net, and it's very similar bejeweled net. And, they're talking about this, thousands of years ago, and, like Vedic texts. And basically, A lot of people in a psychedelic experience see something very, very similar to that. I've had a trip myself recently where as opposed to an elfin woman standing over me, it was some family members, and they sort of disappeared into the mist and became this translucent web with bejeweled nodes, sort of almost a like a neon purple web in space. But of course, yours sounds like maybe it was more of a high fantasy tinge to it, wouldn't you say?
I would definitely say that. I mean, it was definitely an elf, pointy ears and everything from standard like Lord of the Rings. I mean, first time I told you about it, you said, "Oh, Galadriel," and I was like, "Yeah, that's actually a good name for it. Yeah, Galadriel's pretty close."
Yeah, that's anytime I've talked to other people about this experience, and I say you basically had, communion with a psychedelic Galadriel, they get really, really jealous.
Well, I don't know if anyone else has had that yet, but I could say I have.
So you come across this entity, she's there with you. What happens next? Like, do you have some interaction?
Yeah, there was a little bit. She just sort of stares at me and smiles, a very warm, inviting smile kind of a thing. Like she's
Sure.
just trying to make me feel comfortable and warm kind of a thing. It's not like she's trying to scare me or anything like that. And she doesn't say anything first. She's just staring at me, and I hear myself say, "You're my heart, aren't you?" Like very clearly, I remember that statement. It's as if my own heart, metaphysical sense of emotional heart, was what I was talking to instead of some other being kind of a thing, is the way it felt to me. And she
Wow.
just nods her head and then waves her hand out. And as she waves her hand out, I'm seeing these snapshots, kind of like on a movie tape reel, like when you're seeing the storyboard of different scenes from a movie playing out.
Yeah.
And there's like 7 or 8 different playthroughs going on of events and times of happy memories of me and my girlfriend. And a few cases where it was friends or other times that were happy for me, but it was primarily with my girlfriend. And she doesn't even move her lips when she talks, but in my head, I can hear her say, "You have missed so many things in between. Never forget what's in between."
And what do you think she meant by that?
It was all of the joy that I wasn't paying attention to and all the happy moments, because I was so bogged down with worrying about all this other stuff that I couldn't control, and that I was worried about it getting even worse, and all the things that I just haven't been able to deal with kind of a thing.
Sure.
I was so focused on the negative that I was missing all of this beautiful moments and joy in the middle of life. Like if anybody's seen it yet, Collateral Beauty explains this pretty much how my mind was telling me in a slightly different way with Galadriel rather than the whole movie of it. It's a recent movie. Look it up if you guys want to. It gives you sort of an idea of what I was experiencing.
Yeah, I haven't heard about that movie. Tell us about it.
It's a recent Will Smith one. It's a couple of years old now, I want to say, like 2018-ish, I think is when it came out. And it's the story about a guy who's running a marketing company, and he's a very big, intelligent person, and he's very empathetic, and he's talking about how you market things. And he's like, you've got love, time, and I want to say death was the third one. There was something else. But it was the 3 main motivating factors for just about what makes everybody do anything kind of a thing. And that's what you use for marketing things. And he's sort of on top of the world and having a great time in life. And he's got married and he has a kid and everything's sort of golden for him. And then his daughter gets sick with a very rare, incurable form of cancer and dies.
Oof.
And the whole rest of the movie is about what happens after the death of his daughter and how crushed he has been and how it's getting back and recovering from his journey of recovering from all of that kind of stuff.
Interesting.
The way it explains the mentality of Collateral Beauty and by its title and what the point it's trying to get to is basically the same thing that Galadriel was telling me in my experience. It's just slightly different ways. But yeah, Collateral Beauty is high on my list of ones to recommend to people if they wanted to understand kind of a thing.
I'm gonna watch that now. That sounds good.
I definitely say watch it. I enjoy the movie. As soon as I watched it, I was like, I'm buying that. I don't care what anyone says.
That's great. Man, yeah, we have a few streaming services, and we just got fiber optic at our house. So I have absolutely been enjoying using the Roku, and I'm going to look that up with that. So it's all kind of new to us, being
Yeah,
well
do that.
connected, you know. So,
Yeah.
oh, go ahead, go ahead.
But after all of that with Galadriel, it was basically just more renditions of seeing some of the different happy moments I missed and overlooked, and looking at my memories in a happier light rather than a depressed light. And after that, she's just sort of stepped back and left, and I was no longer in the white void with the tree or anything, and I was just reminiscing in memories and crying more and letting more of my angst and everything out.
Yeah,
And I just felt better and better the more the rest of the day went.
that's fantastic.
Well, time, I should say, not day. It wasn't that long of an experience.
Full day long. How long would you say that it lasted for you?
Well, I fell asleep definitely late in the night and slept through the last half of it. I'm not for sure how long it kept working when I was asleep, but I would definitely say, I want to say 6-7 hours-ish, maybe.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds about normal. Probably the last hour was pretty mild, I would imagine.
Oh, yeah. I don't remember much after the Galadriel scene other than just crying and reminiscing on memories and figuring out all the happy points I missed.
Well, and I think crying is something that's very underrated. Like, people don't realize how much they need to. I had a friend recently as well who I was able to witness her experience, and she had been divorced recently and had not admitted to herself that it was a big deal and that she was hurting. And, we kind of talked about it before she went in, and, I said, you're probably going to have to deal with whatever you're trying your hardest not to think about. And of course, she thinks about how sad she is and just starts crying. And she said it was like a weight lifted off her shoulders, Was your experience crying similar? Did it feel healing?
Oh, yeah. It was basically just letting all of the bad emotions out kind of a thing finally, rather than trying to bottle them up, because I'm a bottler. I bottle everything. I usually just say, just suppress it, deal with it later at some point whenever you can, kind of a thing. But so letting it out definitely made it feel a lot more light on my body.
Yeah, I think that's really great to hear. And I think that's one thing personally for me that the psychedelic experience in general has helped me through. And I'd say especially San Pedro cactus, but to a certain degree, psilocybin as well, is this idea that so many of us hold our emotions. We get upset with someone and we estrange ourselves from them, and we hold that anger for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, stay mad about some small transgression from so many years ago. And it's really taught me to just let emotions, feel what I'm feeling and let it move through me. And that kind of resonates a little with me about kind of what you were saying,
It's also part of something that I've dabbled in a little bit in research and stuff like that and learning about with like the Bushido code for ancient samurai in Japan. A lot of people didn't follow the code as strictly as it was laid out. I mean, no code ever is. Even the Knight Errant code in Europe wasn't followed so strictly, even though it's the same kind of mentality. But as part of the Bushido code, one of the training points is you're supposed to learn how to experience all the full range of your emotions, but never let them dictate your actions. So you're not bottling or suppressing emotions. You're experiencing your anger. You're experiencing your sorrow. You're experiencing your joy. You're experiencing everything. But your actions are dictated by a logical, rational mindset, not by what your emotions are telling you to do. And that's what I've strived for ever since I've learned that, ever read about that. And oh my God, is it a lifelong process? You're going to stumble, but you have to keep trying it. And you have to learn how to process your emotions at the time instead of suppressing them and going on with them.
And I feel like
It's just a trick.
And I feel like so many people have the tendency to bottle up their feelings and hold on to them and lie to themselves. And sometimes, using these substances or even through other contemplative practices like meditation or yoga or, other things that exercise your mind and your body, sometimes you have to come face to face with yourself. And it kind of seems that a lot of people don't want to do that, and they just have a terrible fear of being alone with themselves,
It's mostly because if they're anything like me, they're afraid of all the bottled up emotions just overwhelming them to the point that their psyche's destroyed, kind of a feeling. It's the dread that I felt. That's why I kept running from my emotions for as long as I could, but I kept also trying to deal with things, but never getting anywhere because my emotions were just destroyed, honestly.
So when you were in that mushroom state, and you were coming face to face with some of this material that you'd been sort of suppressing, what did you feel at that time? Like, what was your reaction to it compared to how you normally would interact with it?
Well, at first it was mostly regret over letting so much build up and get to me without dealing with it sooner, kind of a thing. Or just overlooking so much because I've got focused too much on those emotions and missing everything else on the other side of the spectrum. I mean, after I processed it a little bit and then I ran into Galadriel, it started being more of okay, you can regret it, but it is the past. It's what has happened. You cannot change it, but you can learn from it.
Yeah.
And that's just what I've been trying to do since, is just try to learn from it, from that point in my life. And I'm trying not to slip back into anything dark or destroying of myself, I should say. I want to try to process things a little better.
So in that process, you said you felt some guilt. Were you able to find any sort of forgiveness for yourself in that as well?
Yep. After the whole Galadriel scene there and everything, I got to the end and I was just sort of like, okay, I missed all of this happiness and it was always there. I just didn't let myself see it. It's easy to let myself not see it, but if I stay focused in the present a little more and pay attention to it, I can be happier and I can keep this stuff from happening again. So I could let go of hating or feeling guilty over it, because it's an easy thing to do when you start getting so depressed or so morose. It's just something you focus on because you want to try to solve it or get rid of it so that you can get better. But then if it just keeps stockpiling it, you can't dig it out of it. So it's easy to get into that state. So I can forgive myself for getting there. I just have to put in work to make sure that I do better for myself from now on.
Well, the hard part about depression, and I watched a show called Big Mouth. Have you seen Big Mouth on Netflix?
No, but it sounds familiar. I've heard about it, I think, somewhere.
It's a pretty cool show, but I want to say it's Nick Kroll. Is that a guy? But that guy and several other comedians do a show basically where they're like middle schoolers. It's a cartoon, and so they've animated it with these different comedians, and one of them, of course, happens to people in middle school as they're going through puberty and their body chemistry and their brain chemistry is changing. She gets depressed, and they symbolized her depression with like this big, warm, purple, cuddly cat that would snuggle up around her but make her feel heavy and just like lay on her chest and keep her down and in bed. And
I have heard of this. I just haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, I think it's a really apt description for getting in that depressed state, because it does get comfortable, don't you think?
Oh yeah, it definitely finds its way to just find its comfy spot wherever it's the most comfortable, weighing you down and holding you there and holding on to you, and it just doesn't leave. It takes effort to shrug it off.
Yeah, and I would say for sure too, like when you've had an experience like this, where you seem to have been very well affected and impacted by this experience, and maybe seeing some change in your life. One thing
Mm-hmm.
that's really important is to see what you can do to maintain it, because I feel like a lot of times you're just given a blueprint of what the problem is and maybe what you need to do to fix it. Not everybody follows through with that, so you can feel great for a few months and then go, slump back into depression and, have some of your bad habits come back and things like that. So,
Mm-hmm.
my question for you is, are there any like daily practices that you've added on to help support your mental health and help support this new lifestyle that you're trying to adapt?
I wouldn't say that it's daily yet, but I'm working on making it more common, where at least the 3 or 4 days a week, I'll think about the Galadriel scene again and just go over it again in my head, and then I'll ask myself, are you missing things again? Are you getting absorbed in things that, while they are important, maybe they're not as all-consuming important as you're making them? And usually I end up catching myself going, yes, I'm actually getting a little too absorbed in this. Like with this last week at work, things have just been crazy because they're falling apart. I'm an IT guy. Computers are breaking left and right. And it was really getting to me. And I just decided this weekend, I really sat down, remembered Galadriel and the message that she was telling me. And I was like, okay, my own heart was telling me you need to focus on some good parts and let it go. So that's what I focused on this weekend. This is just, okay, the week was rough. Those weeks will happen. We need to move on a little from here. So it's an ongoing process. I am worried of slipping back, but I'm trying to do things here and there and remember and be conscious of what I slipped into before and trying to remember how I got there.
Sure.
So I'm trying to do at least one thing a day that's taking care of problems that might be weighing me down subconsciously or something. If it's something small like some kind of bill or something that I haven't been able to pay for a while, or I've got some project or issue at work that really needs to get done and I haven't been able to get to it for a while, I make sure to make time to get it done. Just get things that are starting to weigh me down off my plate, kind of a thing, and make sure that they're solved, if they're solvable, quickly, kind of a thing.
Yeah, certainly. I think of it a lot in my life, like the way I manage my garden. As I walk by, when there's weeds that come up, or a lot of times grass from the yard grows into my garden beds. I'll walk by, and every time I walk by, I just have committed to myself that I'm going to pull 2 pieces of grass out by the roots from the garden. And just doing that every time I walk by, I probably walk by 10 times a day. That's, 20 weeds per bed that I'm pulling. So it's looking pretty good with very little effort, And I feel like, in the words of Joe Dirt, life's a garden, dig it?
Yeah, there's some immortal words right there. And it actually hits on a pretty good point. Honestly, especially here in America, I can't speak for any other countries or cultures because I've never been outside the U.S. And had much contact with people from outside the U.S. But we in the U.S. have this big thing for we want the big change result. We want it now. We don't want to work for it. When honestly, a lot of the times we can solve a lot of big problems for ourselves with just a little bit of work here and there every day. Just like you're saying, with 2 blades of grass every time you pass by something.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very small amount of dedicated effort, but it means you have to do it every day, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
It's not about doing a lot one day. It's about doing a lot over several days or several months or even years. Just do a little bit every day.
And that's why, when I talk to people a lot about psychedelic integration, for me, that's kind of the process of what you do after the trip. And, integration can refer to how you've received this message, you have this information, you've gone over this psychological material with yourself. And so how do you integrate that experience into your life? Because theoretically you have some sort of new programming, right? So you need to make sure you can use that to get things done. And it seems like for me, adopting some sort of daily practice, something small, is so essential. Um,
Hmm.
and a lot of times, a way that I like to address trips and try to at least go through that first part where you're trying to understand it, you're trying to, as you said, you're trying to think about it, like periodically think back over it. I would recommend, if you have the ability or the interest, to write a trip report, just a journal for yourself of what happened. So you remember it, you have it in writing. So years later, you can come back and read it again and be right back there in the scene. I've certainly taken to drawing a lot of my trip experiences. So it helps me document some weird things that I've seen or thoughts that I've had or feelings that I had.
You're a
And
better artist than I am, so I think I might stick to the journaling.
well, and I've always thought you're a very good writer. So um,
Yeah.
I'd love to read a trip report from you because I'll tell you, trip reports are cotton candy for me. I love reading those.
Hmm.
I also read a lot of academic articles on this stuff, but that's just so enjoyable for me to read. It's like crazy sci-fi stories.
Yeah. Well, mine will be more on the fantasy side of things, just to warn you, since you already know.
That's true, and I felt like your experience was very high fantasy, and you're really into fantasy.
Hmm.
And mine are always very sci-fi, and I am very much into science fiction. So
I was honestly surprised mine bordered more fantasy because I'm a big sci-fi guy too.
yeah,
Like I am a diehard Trekkie.
yeah, yeah. But I kind of felt like I wasn't super surprised because you do Pathfinder and Dungeons and Dragons and all that good stuff.
Yeah,
I
true. Sure enough. Yeah,
I think you did Warhammer for a while. Is that right?
not Warhammer. No,
No.
there was a similar game that does clicks things like that, and it was it's not Mech Warrior. It's Mech something or another though. I did that for a little while, but I haven't been into that for a long, long time now.
Gotcha. So, and I guess this is one thing that makes this interview that we're doing really interesting for me is most people, when you think about someone trying a psychedelic plant medicine, or in this case, a fungi medicine, if we're splitting hairs, um, most people think it's going to be some hippie, someone already smoking a bunch of weed every day, or who, has dreadlocks or something, and which are all,
That is the unfortunate stereotype at this point, honestly.
and in my opinion, those are all fine things to be. But I would say you are definitely not the stereotype of a person that I think of when I think about the psychedelic community. But really, there are, I think, a really good contingent of nerds, and in particular, people who are into science,
Hmm.
and a lot of science fiction people who end up into this stuff because you get to experience some pretty sci-fi things firsthand, and
Hmm.
um, I feel like it's the kind of person who wants to explore mental space, and maybe that's the legacy of people like Carl Sagan and folks who've contributed.
Probably.
You know, I know we both like him.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so I guess for you, um, overall, what final thoughts do you have on your experience?
For me, overall, it was definitely a worthwhile experience to have. And now knowing how it affected me, I don't, it's kind of funny to look back and see how scared I was to see what I might go through, kind of a thing. Because if anybody watched my before interview, I was scared of having weird, crazy, bad trips and everything, and I ended up with Gladriel. So it turned out a lot better than I feared it would be. And honestly, I'm glad I tried it. I'm glad that I didn't just try it on a whim, though, and that I did some research to
Yeah,
understand what it does and how it works, and that I used a resource like the Johns Hopkins study results to understand that it is something that does do an actual effect that might work for some people, so that it might be worth trying. Like for me, I've never really done any drugs, really. I
no.
mean, I've smoked cigars and stuff. I've
Mm-hmm.
drank alcohol, but I've never really done marijuana. I've never done mushrooms till now. I've never done any any other kind of substance or anything. It's just not who I am.
And for anybody watching this, like in the after school special, I'm the bad friend who is like, Brian, we should smoke some weed though. And not really though. I've always told him, it's an open offer. I'm never gonna push it on you. So that's just more of a joke, but I've kind of for years hinted like, hey, do you think you'd like to try some weed? And
Yeah.
so I was like,
Our
no,
reply's
no,
always
no,
just,
no.
yeah, I'm good. We're fine. Let's
So
hang out though.
so it was actually Brian's like first time with cannabis and with psilocybin. So what I'm curious then for you, because I know the cannabis would have hit you first.
hmm
So my curiosity then is, what did you find that experience to be like, and how did you find it as being different than when the mushrooms kicked in?
Well, it was definitely a very sharp reaction. It came on a lot faster, like you said, definitely for sure. And it definitely did things that I had heard was probably stuff that would happen, like different senses intermingling and everything.
Tell me
Like
more
the
about
prime
that.
example I can give you is the guy who was I forget what you call it, place setting, or basically giving me a safe environment that was in checking in on me to make sure everything was okay while
Yeah,
I was
that could
having
be
my
like
experience.
trip sitting, or some people
Trip sitting, yeah.
call it
Okay.
holding space for the other person.
Okay. Yep. So the guy who was doing that for me was chatting with me and everything before everything sort of kicked in, just to make sure everything kicked in. And as we were chatting, I was reclining in a chair and my eyes were closed. But you know that old scrolling text from the Star Wars that was scrolling back to tell the
Yeah.
story? Our conversation, word for word, was being spelled out like on a text message. He was on the left, I was on the right, and it would type out the words and fade up and get
Wow.
smaller and everything
What kind of
as we were
font was
having the
it?
conversation. What was that?
What kind of font was it? Was it yellow?
Uh, I want to say it was around about a 14 to start. Looked Arial to me.
Was it white
I
or yellow
expected.
or?
No, honestly, it was more like an old TV video game, like old cathode ray tube
Oh,
style with
really?
blue and sort of like orange neon outlines to the letters. It was all kinds of weird colors. It was
Man,
kind of like an old 8-bit game kind of text.
that's pretty cool. See, that's why I like to ask these real probing questions, because, someone will say, oh, I saw letters going across my vision. It's like, well, how much cooler is it now that we know it's CRT 8-bit graphics letters?
hmm
It's a big enhancement for me, storytelling wise.
Plus, you
Um,
get a much better visual. Yeah, yeah, and you understand it a little more.
yeah, and so that was just from cannabis.
Yeah, it was
That's
also short lived though. That only lasted like a half hour to an hour.
so.
But that I don't know if that's necessarily how long it lasted because by then I was in the dark laying down and closed my eyes and there was no one else there or anything's going on. So
So we have a mutual friend growing up, JE, as you recall. Um,
yeah.
this guy, the first time we ever led him down the dark path to smoke the wacky tobacco, he ends up sitting on the couch with me and my friend Henry, and I had a bong. I had a little bong, and I was moved out when I was like 17, 18. So like totally just smoking a bong in my living room. Still doing good in school and stuff, but maybe not super responsible. um, but so I led my friend down the poison path, and he takes a big old rip, and we're sitting there. And a few minutes later, he starts kicking his foot, moving it around like a sword. He thought his foot had become like a saber, and he was waving it around and cutting like triangles and octagons, like shapes. Like that again was just from marijuana, but it was only the first time, and I hallucinated my first time too.
Mm-hmm.
We were sitting in a friend's car. We'd hotboxed it, and my buddy pulls out a little pin, like a pin light, and he turns it on, and because it's so smoky, it there's a beam of light. But as he did that, it goes, and it was like a lightsaber. So,
Mhm.
that's really interesting that you had a hallucination your first time. I think the way people explain it is that it's your first experience with cannabis, so your brain doesn't know quite how to react to it. So
Mhm.
as it establishes a new pathway, sometimes as an artifact of that process, you might see shapes and colors, or you know see someone speaking, which is really, really
Mhm.
cool.
I just see the words. They scroll, apparently.
Wow. So that's really interesting. So when the mushrooms hit, how did that feel different physically for you compared to cannabis?
And from what I can recall, the shift was a lot more subtle. The marijuana came on very sharp, and it was sort of aggressive feeling, is the way that I describe it. It wasn't something that I personally enjoyed the feel of,
Mm-hmm.
but mushrooms was a much more subtle, sort of slower build up, and it just sort of coaxes you into the state, kind of a thing. Whereas marijuana is just like, hey, you're here.
It certainly is.
It's like, I've got you here. Have a nice day. Where mushrooms is like, we're gonna get you there. Just come with me.
Yeah,
Just this way.
I recall as Brian and I were talking afterwards, prior to this conversation, he spoke to me about being high on cannabis, and he said, so a lot of times when we're hanging out and you're high, this is how it feels. I'm like, yeah. He's like, it's amazing that you're functional.
That was my main question, because there were times if I was just sitting still and staring in one direction, my vision would start shifting and I'd feel like I'm rotating and the room was going different directions. And I was like, how do people function on this? But people do, apparently.
I think you'll find that that's very much just a one-time thing.
The first time kind of thing.
Sometimes if I get very, very high, I'll get the spins. But mostly it just relaxes me now. And sometimes, like right now, it makes my mouth very dry.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, yeah, I never hallucinated past the first time, and I don't know about many who have. So if you ever try it again, it'd probably just make you just chill out, feel comfortable, maybe a little paranoid, maybe not, hungry. Things will taste good.
From what I've seen of you and other people at times, the munchies are definitely a real thing. It's not just some
Absolutely.
rumor.
No, me and Brian used to be roommates years ago, and I was always coming back from the gas station with an Arizona sweet tea and like a microwave toxic burrito. Like,
Hey, you had to feel the munchies.
I would never do that nowadays, but the gas station trips are sustainable only when you're a teenager with a teenager metabolism.
Yeah. After you get a little older, your body just cannot handle the chemicals in that stuff.
No.
I know mine can't much anymore, but
No, I certainly can't. I don't know. We're all getting old. That's okay. So that's the thing about me and Brian is we're very good friends. So we could probably bullshit with each other until the cows come home. But we're almost about hitting our 90-minute mark pretty quick here. So I think we'll just wrap up with a last few little things. I guess, Brian, this is your opportunity. Kind of, a few people will probably watch this, and maybe like 15 or 20 would be pretty cool. And so, what do you have to say to anybody, just from your point of view as a totally normal guy, not a hippie, never done a drug until this experience? What would you tell them if they're thinking about trying this out?
Well, first off, everybody's normal. Doesn't matter what they're into, man. Come on.
That's true. That's true.
But honestly, for anyone like me, if you're not really into drugs and everything like I'm not, do your research first. The only real reason I even contemplated doing the experience was because of the Johns Hopkins study. Go try to find that, look that up, look up actual scientific articles and everything. Do your research. understand how it works and what it does in your brain and all that kind of stuff. But also try not to go in with some certain expectation of what you're going to have or see or do with it, because it's going to take you where it's going to take you. It's best, as I've been told and as I've now experienced, to just let it take you where it will go. Ride the wave. Don't try to force it.
Mm-mm. Yeah, I always say, like, it's good to set an intention and try to figure out, like, what you hope you'll come out of it with. Like, it's nice to have a wish list, but, at the end of the day, you go in there with that, but you also need to be ready to just completely let that go and realize that that's not the real underlying problem you were looking to solve,
If you take this as a way to get into something in your mind that you're just not letting yourself get to on the conscious level, it can be a great help for you. If you're just looking to see things or have a good trip, yeah, sure, fine, whatever, go ahead and do it. But I don't think you're going to get as good of a intention or good of a change out of it if your whole point is to just go and have fun.
And do you feel like you're embracing the change that this has brought to your life?
Trying to, anyway.
Yeah.
It's a daily process, step by step.
Do you feel pretty confident that you'll be able to maintain and keep doing the work to work on yourself?
Oh, yeah. I just have to keep it up is all.
Great. Yeah, I think it sounds like you're off to a really good start. And the interesting thing is I think a lot of people in our Western mindset, and me and a few friends have been talking about this recently, we look at it and say, I want to take this thing to cure me, and then I'll just be good. End of the story. You're done working. And I think it's kind of, for me at least, it was the beginning of a process. And in my life, it has been an integral part of my process for mental health and, just more awareness of myself and being more in the moment. But you also can't let up on the things that you do to make yourself healthy and happy and self-care, But
Gotta take care of yourself.
Yeah.
All right.
Any closing thoughts before we sign off here?
I guess I would just say, you guys all take care of yourselves and have a good day. Be safe out there, all right?
Yeah, and thank you all for tuning in and watching this. And I know personally, if you're at home watching me and my buddy yammer away on YouTube, I think that's a really good, cozy, safe place to be. And I hope you found our conversation entertaining and enlightening in some way. And if you want to be interviewed about trip experiences, please feel free to shoot me a message at talkinginTechnicolorPodcast@gmail.com. Or you can also check out our Facebook page, Talking in Technicolor. We'll probably have a website and actually put up audio versions of the podcast through Anchor. That's the application I'm using here soon. As I have told Brian today, I just got fiber optic internet and it's lightning fast, so it's going to be a lot easier for me to upload higher quality versions soon. So, and nice audio versions, I hope. We'll do some ASMR. So, all right. Well, thanks, guys, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks for watching the show.
Yeah, have a good one.